it is not just mass migration, but we have brought in large numbers of people who are very difficult to assimilate, who will have a long trajectory of difficulty ahead of them. We have sacrificed social cohesion on this utopia of just bringing in, basically outsourcing, having our own babies. And there's a large swath of ideological immigrants from Muslim majority countries who become radicalized in Western mosques and Islamic centers and online. And I think if you put that cocktail together, you're creating problems, and the problems have already been created, but you're exacerbating problems of social cohesion, and those are really very bad problems.
Thank you so much, Ayaan, for joining us. Appreciate your time. Who do you think is winning the 2024 election campaign?
So I think it's 13 days before election night. And if elections were held today, based on the information that's coming in from the polls and from the news media, it's highly likely that Donald Trump will win the election.
And why do you think he's winning?
I think it's a number of things. Part of it is very superficial and very recent. It is the way Joe Biden was cremated, and then the choice of candidates. And I think that's getting a lot of discussion. But I think he is addressing the issues that were not addressed in 2016 when he won for the first time in that surprise election. So we should look at the economy, if you look at immigration, all of the features of globalization that you also see in Europe. I see them in America, and I think that's mainly why he's winning. It seems that voters trust him more with internal prosperity and external peace. And he has a record he's running on. And unfortunately for the Democratic Party, Kamala Harris has not removed herself, or somehow she hasn't distanced herself enough from Joe Biden. And the disastrous record that she and Biden oversaw. And then, of course, there's her own persona. She's just incredibly in over her head. And that's, I think voters have had enough of being made fools of.
And has your own views on Donald Trump changed over the years?
Well, I'll say in 2016, that's when for the first time I got to know him. I didn't, I didn't grow up in America, so I didn't know much about American culture. But 2014, 15, when he started running for president, that's when I just consumed the media. And I voted for Hillary Clinton because I thought that can't really be a serious presidential candidate. And the media then, I think, really just took the demonization of Donald Trump to such great lengths. And I remember, was it Joseph Epstein who coined the term Trump derangement syndrome? And so what I was able to do in his first term was, like many voters, watch him very closely and then quickly see that there's a distinction between his policies and the cabinet he put together, and the outcome of those policies on one hand, and then the trolling that he does, tweeting, the sort of behavior that drives a lot of people up the wall. And I was one of those people who would say, I just wish he wouldn't say that. And then over time realized he's going to say what he's going to say. But politics is about policy, and the policies he was delivering at the time were policies that were good for America, and most Americans were happy with it. The economy was good, gas prices were down, the border was under control, and we didn't have wars. And if he's running on that record and he says he can bring something along those lines, then that would be great. He was also, in my view, very good to our allies. Maybe Netanyahu is now waging a war for the existence of Israel has more confidence in a Trump administration, had more confidence in a Trump administration, because Trump was tough on Iran. But also Trump was good for NATO, because I think he made them realize that they couldn't just freeload on America, that they had to pay their fair share in a world that's getting increasingly dangerous. And so he talked to them like a businessman. There was something very refreshing about that. I very much celebrated the Abraham Accords because, as you know, for years and years, I've been talking about the sphere of radical Islam. And with those Abraham Accords, we have a few things. Some of them are talked about a little bit. For instance, the fact that Saudi Arabia stopped financing the Muslim Brotherhood and spreading Wahhabism and Salafism across the world. That's underappreciated. That happened all under Trump. So I think that if we allow ourselves to have a rational look at him and say, he is going to be making the jokes he makes, the trolling that he does, but his policies are sound, then I think Americans are making the right choice now to give him a second term, if that's indeed the outcome of the election.
And what about the Muslim ban, the so-called Muslim ban that Trump instigated in his first term? Would you support that coming back? What did you make of that policy?
I wouldn't call it the Muslim ban. I think it was people who are deriding him called it and framed it that way. He said, and I think this is more relevant in 2024 than it was in 2016, that we can't just have wide borders, wide open borders, and let all sorts of people unvisited into the United States, especially people who are coming from countries, broken down countries, use a different term. And many of them Islamists who are sworn enemies of ours and who are saying they want to destroy us. So what I expect if he comes back to power is that he is going to go. We'll have, he'll continue with the border wall. And he is going to put in some semblance of vetting when it comes to the people we allow into the country and those we keep out.
Some people accused Trump of having anti-Muslim rhetoric. You know, that's sort of changed over time. I think his views on Muslims, particularly in this election, perhaps have changed. So what do you make of his kind of rhetoric towards Islam and Muslims?
I think what we learned from Donald Trump is just ignore his rhetoric and look at his actions. And if you look at his actions, if he has managed to persuade the Saudis and the Emiratis and other Arabs to accept the existence of Israel, to even consider security and economic ties with them, and who knows what's beyond that. And if you listen to Arab Americans today, I was just looking at the polls, there are more Arab Americans who are saying they will vote for Donald Trump than for Kamala Harris. But we have in America a large group and a growing group of Islamists who are anti-American, who are anti-Israel, and who hate our country and our society. And I think if someone is going to stand up to them, it is Donald Trump, and he's going to do it with the help of other Arabs and Muslims. And the Biden administration gave these people a blank check. And that is why we are in the nasty situation where we are now, where obviously the Biden or Harris administration cannot give the Islamists what they demand, which is the demise of Israel. But they sort of made them think that they could. There's a story in the news that Israel's plans to attack, to retaliate against Iran have been leaked. This is happening under a Biden-Harris administration. I think it's just these sorts of really outrageous things that the Biden administration has done and never apologized for. And she's not giving us any inclination of when I become president, I'm going to do things differently. She's just throwing out these word salads and yeah.
Are you not worried? Are you not worried that Trump himself is actually courting Islamists? I know that he was endorsed recently by the mayor of Hamtramck, which is America's only Muslim majority city. Really? And this mayor, according to research from the Middle East Forum, has said some pretty controversial, radical statements around Israel and Gaza and so on. And Trump had a photo opportunity with him I think, just last week. So you're not worried that the Republicans are leaning in too much to try and gain the Muslim vote into some more radical elements?
I think there is this expediency of just getting the demographics because of the, how close the elections are. Just get anyone you can, get anyone to vote and everyone to vote. But once in office, I do not think that the Trump administration is going to empower the extremists. Let me put it this way. I have more trust in the Trump administration not empowering the extremists than in a Harris administration, which, first of all, gave him so much when she was vice president of Biden. So that's the Biden administration, and continued to promise them even more. These demands, for instance, for a ceasefire, or these uncritical demands for a two-state solution immediately after Sinwar's death. It's stuff like that that I find really scary. That is handing lots and lots of gifts to the Islamist regime of Iran and to the extremists. And I don't think that a Trump administration would do that.
Moving on to the Kamala Harris campaign and how they've treated Muslim voters, do you think that they have conversely actually done more than Donald Trump to court with Islamists, to cooperate with these radical protesters, these anti-Israel, pro-Gaza, in some cases pro-Hamas protesters? I know that when they've even breached like democratic events and rallies, and you've got Kamala Harris saying that person has a point as they get dragged out. So what do you make of Kamala Harris, the Democrats' relationship with these people?
So I think of Kamala Harris as part of the far left wing of the Democratic Party. I don't see her as a moderate, but she's also prepared in order to become president to flip-flop. And that flip-flopping is causing, because she doesn't explain the flipping and the flopping, it's causing her a lot of credibility with all sorts of voters, including the Muslims or radical Muslims and pro-Palestinians that she and her administration had emboldened to begin with. And so if you embolden these groups, ideological groups, for years, and then when the moment itself comes, you don't deliver, and suddenly you start to say you stand with Israel, you confuse everyone. And politics is about policy. And so people who supported her and who supported the Democratic Party are looking for these policy, either not just the promises, but real actions. And she is disappointing the Jewish communities when she fails to see Prime Minister Netanyahu when he comes, and she is failing to get the endorsement of the Islamists and pro-Palestinians that she courted for a long time, where she condemns Sinwar's death. So she has put herself, and whoever runs this machine, they've put themselves in this lose-lose situation because they don't want to choose. It's very difficult. I want to give her the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, she was someone else's vice president. Vice presidents are not, usually they don't hold very important positions in terms of decision-making. She is her own person. Well, then let her come forward and let her then define herself as, forget about all that stuff. I regret it. This is who I am. This will be my policies. She hasn't done anything sort.
Why do you think so many Arab Americans are voting for Trump when he's so explicitly pro-Israel compared to Kamala Harris?
Because Arab Americans are not a monolith. And there's a whole swath of Arab Americans who care about pocket issues like inflation and gas prices, and who do not like these extreme woke positions that the far left within the Democratic Party have taken. I'm thinking of issues like gender, and also even issues like border. Everybody wants, family values, safe neighborhoods. Those Arabs will vote for Donald Trump because of his policies. And then, of course, there are many of them who care about what happens in Gaza. And I think there are also many rational Arabs, increasingly, that I'm seeing, who don't blame Israel and who don't blame American policies, but who lay the blame where it belongs, which is with Hamas and with the Islamist regime of Iran, who are using Arabs and Muslims as, disposable tools for their crazy ideological objectives. So I think that explains that fortunately there are Arabs and Muslims in America who identify more with America than they do with the conflicts of the countries they left behind.
Do you support Trump's policy of mass deportations?
I support Trump's policy on bringing back border controls and a sane, effective border control. And part of that is going to have to do with some form of deportation.
On the scale that he's talking about, potentially tens of millions of people, those are, the number of people, illegal migrants who've entered the US. I think in the last administration, people talk about 8-10 million people. So do you support deporting all those people? It's quite some people would say it's quite an extreme policy. Others would say, this is what we have to do to secure our country.
I think when you use the word extreme, you make yourself vulnerable to the objection that what was happening at the border was extreme. To just completely, throw it open for everyone to walk through, that was an extreme policy because it was a choice to do it that way. And now the next administration has to come in if they win. And they're coming in on the promise that they're going to close the border and they're going to bring back an orderly immigration system where America chooses who they let in. And part of that is, yes, it is removing people and how it's going to be done. And the numbers, that's an operational question. And I think let's get there when we get there.
I want to talk more broadly about immigration into Western countries. Are you concerned about demographic changes in places like Britain, France, Germany, and the United States because of mass migration?
Very much so. And in fact, lately, it's all I have been talking about since October 7 last year. And the reason is, it is not just mass migration, but we have brought in large numbers of people who are very difficult to assimilate, who will have a long trajectory of difficulty ahead of them. We have sacrificed social cohesion on this utopia of just bringing in, basically outsourcing, having our own babies. And there's a large swath of ideological immigrants from Muslim majority countries who become radicalized in Western mosques and Islamic centers and online. And I think if you put that cocktail together, you're creating problems, and the problems have already been created, but you're exacerbating problems of social cohesion. And those are really very bad problems, to speak like Trump and just use the word bad. There are very bad scenarios imaginable if the West continues on this path of peoples of different ethnicities and religions having confrontations. We've had a foretaste of it in the summer in the UK, and the British government followed up with censorship. So it's just really sad that every time the issue of immigration comes up in Western societies, Western governments respond with censorship and repression of the people who are complaining about mass immigration. So right now, these populations are voting. They're showing their displeasure by going to the ballot box. But if over time they fail to achieve what they want through the ballot box, then you can imagine that, all sorts of other channels will be tried. And that's tragic. And it's irresponsible leadership.
You talked about clashes between ethnicities and religions. I want to focus on ethnicities. Some would say, that's racist. You can't say that importing people of different ethnicities is going to cause problems. We have to be colorblind. What do you make of this issue of ethnicities and mass immigration?
We have this problem of ethnicities because of this crazy philosophy of multiculturalism that we experimented with starting. I know of it since the 1990s. And the idea is you're going to have what they call cultural pluralism. So there'll be no dominant culture. And to have a dominant culture of the host society, that is the host society's racist. And the dominant religion of the host society, or if you shouldn't be imposing that on everyone else. And so you have problems on two different channels. One is the relationship between the people who come mainly from developing countries into the developed world, and the developed majority of the population is white, and the people who are coming in are black and brown and they're colored. So there is that anti-tension. And that tension, the rational way of resolving that means you are coming here into our country. Therefore, you assimilate, you change your way of life and your customs, you obey ours, etc. Excuse me. The second plane is then the one between the conflict of the different ethnic groups that's coming. The Indians and the Pakistanis or the Bangladeshis in Britain having all sorts of tensions with the Hindu and Sikh communities, the Christian Lebanese and Muslim Lebanese fighting, the Eritreans and the Amharas from Ethiopia. I come from Somalia. I was used to be based in clans. And you can have, when I first arrived in 1992, I was put in an asylum seeker. And there were all of these knife fights that were breaking out. And so the host society has to have a way to deal with these tensions and stop importing all of these tensions. And we haven't managed to plan for that. We just, through the last 3 or 4 decades, we were saying people are coming here largely through the asylum process. And the asylum process is one of compassion. People are having a hard time there. Syria is broken down. Eritrea is broken down. These poor Somalis, Afghans, just bring them in because they have nowhere else to go. We are rich. We should be the ones who are generous. That is not policy of any kind. And this is the kind of times, you let this go to the scale that this thing has taken, and then you get huge problems with social cohesion. So multiculturalism doesn't work. I think what would work now would be to say, we are not going to have anyone no more immigrants that are an underclass or that could form an underclass. We're just going to focus on assimilating the ones that are already here. And then we would, in my view, have a dominant culture, which is Western liberal Christian and secular culture, where there's a separation of religion and politics, where women are respected, where we have the rule of law, and where crime is, crime is upheld and enforced. That's the dominant culture. And if you don't abide by that, we will help you go home. In fact, Sweden is doing something along those lines, but in a much softer way, where they're offering people who are born and raised in Sweden, but who are not assimilated, they're offering them money to go back to the countries of their parents' countries of origin. And this is an admission of a failure. And I think it's wrong then to keep the border open for people to keep coming when you have assimilated ones who are already there.
What about the issue of ethnic demographic decline? Do you think that it is rational for people in countries like Britain that were historically 99% white British to be worried about becoming a minority in their own countries? Now, that is something that in the mainstream discussion, particularly on the left, is seen as a taboo, racist, bigoted position. It's the great replacement theory. It's just totally untouchable. You're not allowed to say that you're worried about becoming a minority, an ethnic minority. Is that something that people should be concerned about, or is a colorblind society the ideal, the Martin Luther King?
If people are concerned about it, regardless of what I think or you think, or the people who are calling others racist think, if those people are really concerned about it, because again, there are levels of tension between the host societies and those people who have come in. There's a great deal of anxiety about the birth rates that we have here. I think if you wanted to, there are rational ways of approaching this, but again, this is a question of political will, which is a selection of who you allow into the country. We look at a small country like Singapore, which is ethnically diverse, but culturally unified. And what they did, Lee Kuan Yew at the time, what he did was, for instance, he insisted that everyone speak English, even though English is not their first language. He insisted on only bringing in the best and the brightest from the world, even though that was considered what if you applied today's deranged terminology, call him racist. And then he said no corruption and zero tolerance on corruption. And corruption is very important. And so I think we could do something along those lines where we say, here is just a set of norms and values we are not prepared to compromise on. And we, meaning the United States, the United Kingdom, and other Western countries, we are able to bring in the best and the brightest from the world. So if we have needs in our economy, in our culture, for people from outside, we can select. And I think we should do that now, because again, we run the risk, because of the irresponsible leadership we've had in the last few decades, we run the risk of not having nation states, but having, what some people have been calling a combination of tyranny and anarchy, tyranno anarchy.
And sorry, just to follow up on that last question, do you assign a moral judgment to that position? In other words, is it rational, is it moral, is it correct, is it right to be concerned about becoming an ethnic minority in your own country? Is that, hyperbole? That's, some people say it's never going to happen. You didn't quite answer the question.
Well, morally speaking, I do believe in nationhood, and I think it's morally superior to the chit-chat that we've been having about the people who are opposed to it and have no alternative, and about looking after the national interest. And I think it's charitable and generous for wealthy countries to choose to help others when they're in trouble, but not at the cost of their own stability. And when it starts to get to become at the cost of your own stability, then that's mindless immigration. We shouldn't be doing that. So it is morally wrong to the people, the taxpayers of the nation states who have, if a war was to occur, it would be their children who would die for that particular nation. And I think to dilute that with large numbers of people who don't have similar commitments, but who are only coming to the material things, I think it's madness. I think that's how we've been doing things before. And I think it's going to lead to all sorts of confrontations that could become violent and get out of hand. And the repression we are seeing, you've seen this in Britain, you've seen it in Germany and France, that when people complain about the changes that are occurring because of the negative consequences of immigration, they are repressed, they are silenced, they are not allowed to talk about it. Everyone is called a racist. What sort of politics is that? And what sort of morality is that?
And just finally, the Islamic threat in Britain, can you evaluate the threat from radical Islam? How has that changed over the last few years in the United Kingdom?
I'm not an expert on the United Kingdom, but when I read papers from Policy Exchange and some of the publications from the people who follow these things in Britain, it seems to me as if we have, in Britain, allowed Islamists to establish themselves in mainly the Muslim Brotherhood and all its tentacles, to establish centers from where they can win the hearts and minds of Muslims. That's always their first goal. It's to Islamize and to radicalize existing Muslims and then to try and convert others. And in doing so, turn those Muslims away from the norms and values of Britain. And so now you have these enclaves of radicalized groups led by Muslim Brotherhood institutions and not exclusively Muslim Brotherhood. There's also Hizb ut-Tahrir that's active. There are pockets of Deoband. These are all the names of Islamist organizations who are hostile to the country that they live in. And some of them want to take it over using the gradual path through Islamization in public space, through Islamization of individuals. Over time, they want to have enough people to vote in Sharia. And others want to do it by force, and others want to do it but through a combination of force and persuasion. It's not a great place to be. And I think what happened after October 7 last year was that suddenly we were confronted with the scale of the problem, given this relentless weekend after weekend, 100,000 people gathering in the centers, major centers of the cities of the UK, again, similar to Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Sweden, and shouting the most vile and most genocidal slogans against the Jewish minorities who live there. So Jewish British people feel unsafe in their neighborhoods. I think one of the most stunning things I've heard from a Jewish friend is that we feel safer in the UAE than they feel in London. I think that's sheer madness.
Ayaan, thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate your time.
You're welcome, Steve.
For more content like this, particularly about US politics at this most febrile time in the world of US politics, don't forget to subscribe to GBN America.